Amid falling passenger numbers and a lack of innovation, the Thatcher government in 1986 deregulated a majority of the local bus industry of the UK, cutting the amount of subsidy available and privatising many of the public service operators, the outcome of which was a significant decline in unit cost and cross-subsidies, while also requiring an improvement to innovation and operating practices so as to remain competitive. However, while the deregulation of the bus industry engendered a competitive need to provide services of greater efficiency and quality than rival firms, the downsides as to this policy would include an increase in mergers, an unstable franchising system, reduced network integration, and a lack of support for a public transport provider now divorced from the local government authorities. These factors combined resulting in a still falling demand for bus travel across the UK. The story begins in the 1970s, where Britain's local bus services were almost exclusively provided by the government-owned firms, who enjoyed a monopoly protection by means of route licenses issued by quasi-governmental officials called regional traffic commissioners, with the service in the 50 major metropolitan areas and main towns being provided by companies owned by local governments. At the time, the regulation of buses in the UK had been dictated by the Road Traffic Act of 1930, which marked the beginning of comprehensive state intervention in the bus industry by its introduction of both quality and quantity regulation through the establishment of a licensing system that was controlled by the regional traffic commissioners. The 1930 Act covered quality regulation of the operators, vehicles and drivers, and quantity regulation of the number and types of services operated, providing an award of licenses to operators to run a service defined by a route and timetable with a specified fare scale, which, once granted, essentially conferred local monopoly rights on the operator, particularly where local services in urban areas were concerned, with such services being developed on a comprehensive basis and provided a coordinated network, parts of which were usually dependent on cross-subsidy. Ownership of the local services was predominantly public, but come the late 1960s, the market in which the bus services operated had altered dramatically with the increased use of private cars, with bus patronage having halved between 1960 and 1980, while the wider industry was finding that operating costs, fares, and levels of subsidy were on the increase. Almost all companies suffered from a shortfall between revenue from fares and their operating costs, and following the Transport Act 1968, the Local Government Act 1972, and the Local Government Scotland Act 1973, local authorities played an increasing role in sustaining public transport through revenue support payments, in line with their statutory obligations to provide coordinated public transport to meet the needs of the population. To retain the network of services and maintain fares at acceptable levels, local authorities were asked to make good the losses by subsidy payments, with the level of support provided varying considerably from area to area. This meaning that, due to the extent of cross-subsidy between routes, it was often difficult to assess the value for money obtained. Bus services in larger parts of rural Britain, together with many commuter-based rail and bus networks in the conurbations, continued in existence only because of the subsidy paid by local authorities and the Metropolitan Passenger Transport Executives or PTEs, PTEs having come into existence under the Transport Act of 1968 and designated the metropolitan counties as passenger transport areas, which had a responsibility for planning local transport services jointly with metropolitan district councils. The national government, meanwhile, owned two large holding companies, the National Bus Company, which, through some 70 subsidiary firms, provided service in the small towns and rural areas of England and Wales, and its Scottish counterpart, the Scottish Bus Group, with the result being that even when there were two or more of these companies providing service in the same area, there was rarely competition, as the firms would coordinate their schedules and fares accordingly, while new entry into the industry was practically impossible for private operators. Under the control of the National Bus Company and Scottish Bus Group, which held sway over the PTEs of 6 English metropolitan counties and the Greater Glasgow area, the vast majority of urban bus services were planned, funded and operated by the PTEs themselves, while a number of other cities and towns had, by historical precedent, municipal bus companies under the control of the relevant district council in England and Wales or the regional council in Scotland. However, the continuing matter of declining patronage, meant that by the late 1970s, external subsidies represented some 15 to 20% of the operating costs outside of the major urban areas, while in the major conurbations, Labour-controlled councils gave large subsidies so that fares could be held at low levels, with subsidies in these areas representing about a third of costs, and in the case of London almost 50%. In 1979, a new Conservative government rose to power under the leadership of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who adopted a three-part approach to the issue of the bus industry as part of her sweeping privatisation and reform of the UK industry, her goal for the bus service being to reduce subsidies, permit competition, and privatise bus operators. The Thatcher government argued that this would improve the passenger experience by making buses and trains more efficient, and would support their commitment to reduce public expenditure and increase the role for commercial objectives, thereby leading to developed policies to reduce subsidies to buses, to reduce the role of local government in planning and controlling bus systems, and to increase competition between bus companies. It was thus decided that the best way to deal with the decline in bus services, the rising costs and increasing subsidies, was to deregulate the industry and allow services to be subject to competition, the basic argument of which was summarised in the 1984 Buses White Paper, which stated that due to bus services having been subject to a highly restrictive licensing system for 50 years, cross-subsidies could be used to bolster weaker routes with the profits of stronger ones, while there was no incentive to develop markets or woo potential customers. Deregulation of the bus industry would therefore come in the form of two separate transport acts, the first being the 1980 Act, which lifted regulations on express coach services and also allowed county councils to set up trial areas in which road service licences were no longer required, and operators could run services on any route they wished. The Transport and Road Research Laboratory, or TRL, reported on the three trial areas of Norfolk, Hereford and Worcester, and Devon, with the outcomes of their findings during 1984 reporting mixed results, qualified by the fact that the areas were largely rural, that the trials lasted only a limited amount of time, and that areas were affected by wider economic factors such as pressure on financial resources and declining demand, which influenced the provision of bus services everywhere. The TRL thus concluded that the gradual decline in rural bus services in the trial areas simply reflected a general pattern and were not demonstrably a consequence of deregulation, with councils in all three counties having achieved a degree of success in replacing services formerly provided by the National Bus Company with privately operated services, thus preserving basic networks with substantially smaller amounts of revenue support. The TRL further stated that deregulation had provided opportunities for operators to experiment with new services, a policy that could not have been adopted previously under the restrictive licensing system due to the political barriers in place to ensure the National Bus Company did not lose its potential share of an already very limited market, though the TRL also noted that deregulation had done little to guarantee significant increases in ridership within the trial areas. In the urban areas, deregulation illustrated that bus services may still be profitable on town and interurban routes, with independent operators providing new services, sometimes complementary to those run by the established operators and sometimes in direct competition, the instances of the latter seeing the established operators respond by reducing fares, increasing service frequencies, adjusting schedules, running free buses, or various combinations of these actions. Following the outcomes of the TRL study, proposals to deregulate local bus services were published in the 1984 Buses White Paper, together with a subsequent series of more detailed consultation papers, the White Paper envisaging the various types of public ownership then existing in the local bus sector being gradually replaced by private companies, and privatisation was seen by the Conservative government to be a means of achieving a more committed management and better access to private capital. As a result of this research, the proposals outlined within the TRL study and White Paper were brought into effect by Part 1 of the Transport Act of 1985, which abolished road service licensing in Great Britain, except in London, from October 1986, replacing it with a system of registration and removing the duties of local authorities to coordinate public passenger transport in their area. Thus, a bus company could register any service that it chose to operate on a commercial or unsupported basis, while the local authority could invite tenders for additional routes or journeys if it considered social needs were not met by the commercial services, and on the condition that it went out to open tender, with the licensing authorities and the traffic commissioners losing much of their former grip over the industry. Once the Act was implemented, any licensed bus operator merely needed to register its intention to set up a service with the traffic commissioner responsible for the area, giving at least 42 days' notice, the operator subsequently being obliged to run the service according to the specification in the registration, with individual bus operators being responsible for the timetable and the introduction of new services, dependent on the operator's opinion of the demand for it and its commercial viability. There was no requirement in the 1985 Act or its consequential regulations for the commercial bus operator to consult before making changes to the timetable and the position of bus stops, with the criteria for registration not including any reference to public demand or to existing services, and objections could no longer be made by other operators or the local authorities. PTEs and county councils were given powers to secure, using subsidy, socially necessary services which were not provided by the commercial market, and controls over these services in terms of fare levels, type of bus, and so on could be maintained, while operators had the right to participate in concessionary fare schemes, and the PTE had powers to compel participation in the schemes, the operators being reimbursed for the net financial loss incurred by participating in the scheme. At the same time, proposals were also put forward to change the structure of the bus industry through privatisation, with deregulation intending to increase competition through added numbers of competitors, and by reducing the possibilities of entry-deterring behaviour, privatisation in itself being not necessarily capable of increasing competition on its own. Part 3 of the 1985 Act required the sale of the National Bus Company subsidiaries to the private sector, with the company reorganising its services into 72 separate companies that were all sold to the private sector or to management and/or employee buyouts by April 1988, with 40 of the companies being bought by management or employee teams, and many of the sales including provision for employee share or profit-sharing schemes. Gross proceeds of the NBC privatisation amounted to £323 million, resulting in a net surplus to the government of £89 million after all debts and privatisation expenses had been accounted for, the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee being critical of the Department for Transport's conduct of the sale of the individual companies, as it felt that they had not accurately forecast their value. 10 bus companies were sold between September 1994 and January 1995 for £233 million, but in a report, the National Audit Office concluded that the key objectives of the sale had all been achieved and that it had raised £30 million more than the original indicative offers. Section 75 of the Act gave local authorities the power to dispose of their bus undertakings, subject to the Secretary of State's approval, with Portsmouth City Council being the first municipal bus company to sell its bus operations in June 1988, and by 1997 only about 7% of passenger services were attributable to the municipal bus companies. London buses, meanwhile, were governed by the London Regional Transport Act of 1984, which transferred responsibility for the bus network from the Greater London Council, or GLC, to London Regional Transport, or LRT, the Act requiring London Transport to set up operating subsidiary companies to run buses and underground services, and in 1985 London Buses Limited was formed as a wholly owned subsidiary. In November 1993, the government announced that it would defer the previously intended deregulation of buses in London, although privatisation of the bus operating subsidiaries of London Transport would proceed, as under London's regulated regime, all services were secured by London Transport through LT buses from private operators following competitive tendering. Its role, in addition to securing services from private operators, was to determine the level and structure of fares to be changed, to determine the general structure of bus routes and their frequency of operation, to provide and maintain the infrastructure, to promote customer information and develop technology, and to ensure operators deliver safe, reliable and clean buses. In Scotland, the position was slightly different, as the Scottish Bus Group, or SBG, operated the buses and coaches, with long-distance journeys, as in England and Wales, being deregulated by the 1980 Transport Act, while local bus services were deregulated in October 1986 by the 1985 Act, though contrary to how the 1985 Act placed on the NBC a duty to draw up plans for its privatisation, a similar duty was not placed on the SBG. It wouldn't be until 1988 that the then Secretary of State for Scotland, Malcolm Rifkind, announced that he would privatise the company, with the Transport Scotland Act of 1989 restructuring the SBG into 10 separate independent bus companies before being privatised, with sales of these firms to have been completed by October 1991, during which the process yielded some £90 million for the Exchequer. The sale was reviewed by both the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee, with the latter being critical of the escalating costs of the sale and the considerable amount spent on work not subject to competitive tender. Following deregulation, the Conservative government remained committed to the promotion of competition in the provision of bus services, and saw competition as in the best interest of the consumer and the public interest, the 1985 Act resulting in dramatic changes to both the operating environment and the pattern of ownership in the bus industry, but with criticism garnered as to predatory behaviour and the powers of the regulatory authorities. The conflicts between rival operators highlighted the absence of a regulatory framework, leaving an ad hoc policing arrangement to the Office of Fair Trade, or OFT, and the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, now the Competition Commission, with the outcomes of a consultation exercise on local bus services in 1993 by then Transport Minister Roger Freeman, resulting in the ruling out of major changes to the legislation, but announced a package of minor rule changes. These included clarifying the powers of the traffic commissioners to make it clear that they could use their powers to regulate the number of buses used in providing a service, and to control the use of duplicate buses, with the government also working with local authorities on the Bus Working Group to look at issues concerning the provision of bus services and ways in which they could be improved. This culminated in an announcement in January 1996 that the government would introduce a number of measures aimed at improving bus performance and to lead to more stable services, including high-quality accessible vehicles, convenient waiting areas, ticketing schemes, good passenger information and traffic management measures. Regulation, though, continued to be a concern throughout the period, with 1985 seeing 3/4 of bus turnover be in the hands of the public sector, while by 1997 this amounted to approximately 7%, many of the more dubious businesses that took advantage of deregulation to run substandard vehicles on profitable routes being squeezed out, and those that remained were committed to modern fleets and long-term investment. By 1997, the three largest private groups, Arriva, First Group and Stagecoach, controlled just over half of the bus market by turnover, and while it could be argued that deregulation failed to deliver the Conservative government's stated objective of halting the decline in the bus industry, it did reduce the costs of providing the services and the government's subsidy. The 20th anniversary of bus deregulation in October 2006 prompted several reviews of how the industry stood and whether it was fit for purpose, taking stock of two basic arguments made on either side of the debate, with criticism of the deregulated system, citing several reports published during the same year that analysed the state of the bus industry and considered whether changes needed to be made, taking into account the general downward trend in patronage levels, the increasing costs to local authorities, and the repeated complaints, particularly in the major metropolitan areas outside London, that the present system was not working. In particular, the Transport Select Committee published a report heavily criticising the current system and calling for the government to make it easier for local transport authorities to take control of bus services in their areas, with issues raised being based around the same fundamental concern regarding the fact that deregulation has not necessarily meant healthy competition in the bus market. The industry by the mid-2000s had been dominated by the big five operators of Arriva, First, Go Ahead, National Express and Stagecoach, who effectively ran monopolies in many areas, even where there were two or more of the big five operating in the same region, though this had not always or often led to streamlined services and cheaper fares. Others pointed to the successes of deregulation, with a book published in November 2005 by Professor John Hibbs, one of the architects of deregulation, stating that after 20 years, the bus industry had become a commercial success, and despite failings in some sectors, there were many examples of proactive responses to the market, with increased investment and some remarkable developments in management and consumer sensitivity, added to further by a better understanding of costing and pricing for the market, and the provision of real-time information to improve the customer experience. While smaller firms that did battle at the periphery of the established giants gave poor perceptions as to the quality of bus travel due to their use of older vehicles and a lack of service consistency, the value of open access had been largely recognized by the leading figures in the industry, while many small operators offered a higher standard of customer care along with lower prices so as to eke out a unique selling point against the big five bus companies. Nevertheless, while the overall proportion of bus travel continues to fall, there are many examples of substantial growth, as was the case of a major service restructuring in Cambridge that led to a 45% increase in patronage over the course of 3 years, though what has been generally lacking in terms of ensuring the effectiveness of bus transport in the UK since the 1985 Transport Act is the commitment of the local and strategic highway authorities to provide the necessary infrastructure to support buses over cars in regular day-to-day service. For instance, one of the main problems that affects bus services, regardless of deregulation, is the need to use public roads alongside regular traffic, leading to common delays due to congestion, which further damages the perception of the bus as a viable alternative to private motoring, the highway authorities having been reluctant to provide buses with dedicated bus lanes or even guided busways, as per those exhibited in Manchester, Cambridge and Luton, essentially turning bus vehicles into single-car, rubber-tired trains. Unfortunately, as local councils and highway authorities are politically conscious and fear potential resentment from the voters should they implement the widespread adoption of bus lanes, these governing bodies remain aloof as to the improvement of the bus operations in their districts, thus leading to a professional gap between urban planners and bus operators that reflects a possible distrust of commercial management rather than centrally controlled government operation. While the Transport Act of 2000 established quality partnerships that were designed to overcome this, leading to the creation of quality bus corridors between strategic regional centres that would be tailored by the council to the needs of the local bus operator, the franchise system engendered by the deregulation of the bus industry means what designs may have been appropriate for one franchise holder may not be suitable for the management of a new franchise holder should it change partway through the development stage, leading to an overall hesitancy to provide major infrastructural improvements on this basis. Therefore, even with bus operations having been privatised under the 1980 and 1985 Transport Acts, government subsidy is still a vital part of ensuring that bus companies remain financially buoyant due to the many problems each service provider still faces in winning over suitable passenger numbers to make a profit, with current forecasts, if government subsidy was removed and bus operators were solely supported by ticket sales, being that every bus service provider in the country outside London would be rendered bankrupt within 3 days. Thus, to summarise, bus deregulation's outcomes proved to be a mixed bag of results when it came to the future sustainability of bus travel in Great Britain, with the introduction of fierce competition between individual bus companies, meaning that new vehicles, practices, commercial plans and information provision was needed to ensure that service quality was raised to the point that it could naturally attract passengers away from private motoring. However, even with the improvements to service quality, a lack of support from local authorities means the effectiveness of buses as a viable alternative to cars remains severely handicapped, while the franchising system means no guarantees can be made that plans for improvements conceived under the tenure of one franchise holder would still be appropriate for another should the franchise change, the only way to ensure a sustained future for bus companies being the leadership of a professional and profit-seeking management in combination with the support and respect of local government planners.